some people will look at me and say, oh, great, this guy's a dreamer. I don't know where he gets his crazy stuff from. But again, when you start to look at the clues of the world, it pushes you towards these conclusions. Even if you fight like heck not to believe it, it just gets, if you're objective and you keep an open mind, these things just get rammed down your intellectual throat, and you're kind of stuck with them.
Well, you, in terms of examples, in terms of this science that you're talking about being beat over the head with, use a lot of the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross when it comes to life after death, her work, right?
Yes, I quote her in the book. As some of your listeners may know, she, in the 60s, was really the definitive work. Hers was the definitive work on death and dying and the stages of grief, the anger, the denial, then the anger, then the acceptance, and so on, 5 stages that every nurse and doctor learns about and many other people have read about. And that's what she did. She was a psychiatrist and spoke to literally hundreds of thousands of people who were experiencing some type of illness and eventually death. But in the latter part of her career, she got really interested in this whole idea of what happens at death and interviewed, I think 20,000 people who had near-death experiences or situations like that. And like any other scientist who is intellectually honest, got her eyes opened. And her writings towards the latter part of her life are just fascinating. If she were on the phone instead of me, you could have had Einstein and Kubler-Ross instead of me. Unfortunately, they're not around anymore, but she would tell you that death is absolutely not what we think it is. Death is nothing to be feared. And in fact, if you live well, if you live your life properly, you shouldn't worry about death for a minute, and it doesn't matter how long you live. It can be a day, it can be 100 years. The time you live is not important. And what's really fascinating to me about her writings is that she parallels the work of the 20th century physicists from a completely different point of view, but comes up with the same conclusions. So on the one hand, you have these brilliant physicists of the 20th century, like Einstein and others, and then you have Kubler-Ross, who comes at this from a more of a spiritual death and dying aspect, and they converge on the exact same points. And when you read this, for me, honestly, it sent a chill up my spine.
Give me an example.
Give an example. She will tell you that when you die, you will see the people who you loved and who loved you, and you will see them at the age that you remember them at. So even though you might be 85 and you might have lost your grandparent when you were 5, you will see your grandparent as they were when you were 5. And again, this is some people, I'm sure people are rolling their eyes when they hear this, as I was, but it fits perfectly with the idea of the frozen block of time, that you can visit any time because they all exist. If time was, as we all assumed it to be, a flow of time, so that the past, once it was over, was gone and grayed out, of course, there'd be no hope to visit somebody who was around 80 years ago. But if you understand more correctly that time is a block of ice, then when Kubler-Ross says when you die, you will see people as they were at the age that you remembered them, it makes perfect sense. It's perfectly believable. So that's one example. There are many more, but these things, again, when I read them, were literally knocked me off my seat. And they just did send a chill up my spine and made me realize that, again, this is such an incredible story that unfolds. And that's what I hope to do in the book. I hope to tell a story, and there are actually 3 short stories in the book. I hope you enjoyed them, that are fiction that kind of set the stage for what's to follow. But this whole idea is an incredible story of what life is and, of course, what life can be. We're not stuck. One thing that we tend to think of is that we are helpless. And the world, as I mentioned earlier, reality just happens, and we're thrust into it, and we're victims of this vast current of reality. But, in fact, it's not that way at all. We have this free will that many of us are familiar with, and this ability to choose literally creates reality. As the butterfly who flaps its wings on the other side of the world will cause a hurricane 10,000 miles away, well, it's the same thing with our actions. And why this is important? It's important because each of us equally creates reality. And people might say, well, come on, the President of the United States is a lot more powerful than I am. He can order a war, even an atomic bomb, and have an effect on hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. What could I do? Well, the truth is, the smallest decision, the smallest action we take, a decision to turn right or left out of a building, which is in a story in my book, can have tremendous effects down the road of space and time, no less so than the president. because each action creates a cascade of additional actions, so that each of us, believe it or not, is in that sense omnipotent. We collectively, billions of times a day create reality. And this meshes perfectly with what quantum physics teaches us about how the world works.
The difficulty in discussing a book like this is it is a series of dots that you connect from page 1 through page 200, whatever, and you have to, when you follow this tale, follow all the dots and see why one connects to the other, and why you conclude what you conclude. And I can't do justice to it in an interview, but I want to get to your conclusion. The book is called The Currency of Life, Uncovering the Clues to Why We're Here. I have to at least get to why we're here. We're here to what?
We're here to learn. And, although no author likes to give away the ending to the book, I feel it would be unfair of me not to leave your listeners hanging, and you've already read the book. The point of life, we are here to learn. But the question is, why are we here to learn? And we're here to learn because this isn't the end. There's something next. Now, of course, people would say, well, I already knew that. I went to church last week. They told me that. Or I went to synagogue. Or I know there's a great beyond because Allah told me. I mean, whatever your religion is, people say, well, that's it. I already knew that. But there are a lot of people who don't accept a scripture or accept the word of a pastor or any religious figure. They just need to know more. And the story that I tell that's based on science and based on the peculiarities of our lives that we've talked about lead us to this conclusion that this is a great stage, a great learning ground. For instance, as I mentioned earlier, each of us is required to do the same things as our parents and our grandparents. We go through the same scene after scene of childhood and adolescence, and we make the same mistakes and again and again and again. And yet we're required to do that. What's very interesting about that idea is you wonder why. It's because each of us has this power to create reality. Each of us creates the universe that we live in, and each of us, by doing that, learns a lot about about the most important things in life, which of course we all believe in our hearts are love and relationships. But what I try to do is explain why this is true, why it's not just a word that you can accept, that there is a story here, that the science and the analysis of our lives does paint this story that life is about something more. If life was about being wealthy and famous, the reason I know that not to be true is because very few people are wealthy and famous. And yet, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, each of us has the power to create reality. Since each of us has this power, no one of our lives can be devalued. I'll give you a very simple example. John Lennon, one of the most famous singers in the world, walks out of his building in Manhattan and gets shot by a nobody. And this happens every day. Some very famous professor or a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher or somebody extremely well respected in the community gets run over by a teenager dropout who was taking drugs in a car. So, wow, somebody so important was eliminated by somebody who is seemingly so unimportant, and then that changes the future for everybody. When Robert Kennedy was assassinated by an unknown, the whole world changed. The Vietnam War could have ended earlier. There would not have been any Watergate. He probably would have beaten Richard Nixon. Each of us has this unbelievable power. So therefore, the currency of life cannot be something that is available to only a few, such as wealth and power and fame. It cannot be. So therefore, we know that the currency of life must be something available to everybody. And the currency of life that's available to everybody really comes down to love. And I try and explain why that is and what that means and how we develop our portfolio of this currency and how that prepares us for what really comes next.
And that's the curveball that you don't really see coming at the start of the book, because you have a book that starts out with quantum physics and with something that sounds a lot like Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, and you end in a very spiritually grounded place where really life becomes solely about, ultimately, serving other human beings. Really, that's where you conclude.
It's not only serving people, it's engaging people. That's even a better word. You know, we all know service is important and it's rewarding and has so many benefits, for probably more for the server than the servee. but it's the engagement. It's the fact I talk in my book, I have a whole chapter about family. Who's family? Tommy, are you and I related?
No.
Of course we are. No, we are. We're family. You're stuck with me. I'm sorry. You'll never get rid of me now. We're family. Well, let's talk about a family tree. You take a family tree and let's draw people really love genealogy and there's all these websites. And so you draw your family tree. So you have your parents, then you have your grandparents on both sides, then your great-grandparents. And you go, so where do you draw the line? Where does the family end? Is it 1 generation, 2 generations, 5 generations? Where does it end? It's totally arbitrary. It's like the lines on a map. Where does Minnesota end? Well, where somebody decides to put a line. But if you look up in space, in the space shuttle, there's no lines on the Earth. Well, there's no real lines on a family tree. It's wherever we decide to stop it. And, of course, we all come from the same place. We all our DNA came from the same woman in Africa about between 100 and 200,000 years ago. Well, I'll tell you something even crazier, that every molecule in your body was around about 14 billion years ago. We are 100% recycled. And not only that, the molecules that are in your body now weren't in your body in the beginning. You've been rebuilt many times over. So when you start to think of these are kind of weird concepts, but especially the one about family. Who's family? Family is really more about relationships than it is about blood or DNA. If they took your DNA and my DNA, they'd have a hard time figuring out who's who. I mean, obviously, we can do that, and that's how we figure out who commits crimes sometimes, but about 99.9% of it's going to be the same. And we all come from the same place, so who we choose to be in our family is totally arbitrary. You can make the case that we're just one giant family, which in fact is actually very accurate. These start to change when you start to look at the world this way, and you realize it's a bizarre place with rules that we didn't understand, with concepts like family and aging. Why do we age? We just accept it, but in fact, we don't need to. Our DNA could be different. You put all this together, and it's a very compelling story. And the most important part of the story to me is that nobody should wake up in the morning feeling insignificant. Nobody should wake up feeling hopeless or helpless. Every one of us has the same power to create reality. None of us is really more important than the other because the most insignificant person tomorrow could change the world. And I don't mean by finding a cure for cancer. I mean by running somebody over or pulling somebody away from a speeding car. Any of these things. Each of our actions is important. There's no one person's action or no single action more important than the other. This is the way the universe works, and it tells a story about hope and about our future and about what we should be thinking about and doing and creating a blueprint for a much, much better world.
It's extraordinary work, The Currency of Life, uncovering the clues to why we're here. Dr. Mark Klein, who, if you'd like some background on him, has practiced medicine in Washington, D.C. for 25 years, holds a faculty appointment at the George Washington University Medical Center. He continues to teach and write on various topics in medicine. I recommend the book. Hope you can find it. I'm sure it's available everywhere. Again, The Currency of Life is the title. Mark E. Klein, M.D., the author. Thank you so much for your time, sir. I really enjoyed your book, and I hope you have great success with it.
Well, you were very kind, and it's been a pleasure to speak with you, and I'm honored that you had me on your show.
Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.